Long before the first sails appeared, this treacherous stretch of coast was a place of shifting shoals and whispered legends, where ships vanished and rumors grew teeth. In the summer of 1718, those whispers became a roar. In the Carolinas, merchants tallied their losses with shaking hands. Governors counted votes, and in London, the Crown counted its embarrassment. Somewhere in the shelter of the Barrier Islands, a man named Edward Teach, known to the world as Blackbeard, had done something far worse than just stealing cargo. He had humiliated authority. With a braided beard and a flair for theatrics, he had made the sea itself feel afraid. Only weeks before, he had blockaded the port of Charlestown, parading his cannons across the harbor while the city's elite watched, helpless. That kind of spectacle could not be forgiven. Pardons could be offered, stories could be spun. But the Crown did not forget the sound of a pirate's laughter echoing off wharves built with royal charters. Further north, in Virginia, Governor Alexander Spotswood felt the tremors. His colony hadn't suffered the blockade, but he lived close enough to feel the threat. Spotswood believed that order, like piracy, was a performance, and if the king's peace could be restored with decisive theater, then decisive theater it would be. He didn't bother asking for permission from Carolina. He reached for the Royal Navy. The task fell to a young officer with something to prove, Lieutenant Robert Maynard. He wasn't given a mighty frigate or a powerful squadron. He was handed to small sloops, the Ranger and the Jane. They were ordinary vessels, shallow-drafted and lightly armed, the kind that could follow a fox into its burrow. Their mission, however, was anything but ordinary. They were to sail south, navigate the shoals that snapped keels like twigs, and bring back a head, not a report, a head. Maynard understood the chilling clarity of his assignment. He heard the stories just like everyone else. The slow-burning fuses Blackbeard wove into his beard during battle, the 6 pistols worn like jewelry across his broad chest, the voice that could roll across the water and make sailors doubt their own hands. But Maynard also understood something quieter. Pirates lived by reputation. If you could strip away the audience, they bled like anyone else. Spotswood's orders were brutally blunt. Find Teach at Ocracoke Inlet, destroy him, and make an example. He even promised a bounty for proof of death, turning rumor into currency. This wasn't justice as written in the law books. It was justice as practiced on the raw edge of empire. As Ranger and Jane slipped down the coast, the water changed. The Atlantic flattened into a deceptive calm, hiding the shifting sandbars beneath. Local pilots were scarce, charts were just guesses, and the wind carried the smell of marsh and decay. This was a place where authority thinned, where the Crown was little more than a distant memory. Maynard leaned into that memory. He drilled his men relentlessly, teaching them to fire low and board fast in these shallow waters. Cannons were as likely to get you stuck as they were to hit a target. The fight would be won with hands and blades. He also practiced deception, rehearsing how to make his sloops look crippled without actually being lost. He knew that Blackbeard wouldn't be drawn out by force alone. His pride would have to be invited to the table. Meanwhile, the Pirate King lingered. Blackbeard had recently accepted a pardon from North Carolina's governor, a flimsy piece of paper he treated like a joke. He'd married a local girl, set up a house, and briefly pretended to be a respectable citizen. But pardons don't quiet hunger. They don't satisfy men who have tasted the freedom of choosing their own battles, and they don't pay crews who have followed a legend into hell and back. Legends, once fed, always demand more. Blackbeard's anchorage near Ocracoke was a fortress of contradictions. The shallow water protected him from large naval warships, but it also limited his escape routes. His sloop, the Adventure, was fast and nimble, but it was burdened by the expectations of a crew that believed themselves untouchable. The inlet itself was a funnel, one way in, one way out. Its sands could save a ship or condemn it, all depending on the tide. This was a place chosen by a man who trusted his instincts more than his luck. But word travels faster than sails. Fishermen spoke, tavern keepers listened, loyal subjects pretended not to hear. By the time Maynard reached the edge of Carolina waters, he knew Teach was close. He also knew that North Carolina's own officials might just look the other way, as the pirate could still be useful to them. The colonies were a patchwork of rivalries, stitched together by distance, and Spotswood's authority faded with every mile south. This knowledge only hardened Maynard's resolve. If this was to be done, it had to be done quickly and decisively. He would not linger, he would not negotiate. He would strike at the precise point where law and water overlapped, and let the result speak for itself. Under the cover of darkness, the 2 small sloops crept closer. Their lanterns were hooded, their men whispering prayers or jokes, each to their own temperament. Maynard walked the decks, memorizing the faces of his crew. Some were seasoned sailors, others were barely more than boys, but they all understood one thing. The man they hunted had built his power by making men hesitate, and hesitation, Maynard knew, would be fatal. Behind them lay the idea of empire, heavy with expectation. Ahead lay a narrow throat of water, and a pirate who believed himself chosen by fortune. The inlet itself didn't care which story won. It waited, patient as the sand, for blood to give it meaning. Dawn would decide whether fear would remain a currency, or finally become a relic. The stage was set for one of the most famous showdowns in naval history. The water around Ocracoke lay deceptively still, the kind of quiet that suggests cooperation while preparing betrayal. Here, the legendary pirate Blackbeard, Edward Teach, waited with the patience of someone who believed time belonged to him. His sloop, the Adventure, rested at anchor in the shallow inlet, her hull light, enough to slip away if needed, her guns angled toward the only approaches that mattered. The tide came and went, as it always had. Teach was a man who trusted patterns. They had never failed him yet. He had every reason to feel insulated, secure. The Ocracoke Inlet was treacherous, its shifting sandbars an unmarked maze that punished any unfamiliar keel. Large warships, the kind the Royal Navy preferred, couldn't follow him here without risking their own destruction. Local pilots, if pressed to guide them, would simply plead ignorance. But beyond the protective geography lay something far more potent: reputation. Teach had learned early on that fear did half the work of violence. So many battles were won before they even began, with his enemy already calculating how much they were willing to lose just to follow orders from a distant authority. Enemies fought the myth first, and by the time they reached the flesh and blood, they were already exhausted. His crew mirrored his own contradictions. Some were hardened veterans who had followed him through the thickest cannon, smoke, and the fiercest storms. Men who believed the beard itself was a kind of talisman, a source of power. Others were newer, drawn by the promise of protection and profit after the king's pardon had supposedly changed his life. They watched him constantly, measuring his mood, looking for reassurance that the old magic, the Blackbeard magic, still worked. Leadership, Teach knew, wasn't just about giving commands. It was a performance. The pardon, inked and signed by North Carolina's own governor, lay folded somewhere aboard his ship. It had been useful, a temporary shield against immediate pursuit. It allowed him to walk ashore without drawing steel, to take a wife, to smile in the daylight. But pardons were fragile things. They relied on memory and goodwill, neither of which lasted long in colonies where fortunes rose and fell with the tide. Teach understood he was living on borrowed time, even if he pretended otherwise. In a move that seemed like confidence, but might have been miscalculation, he had reduced his crew. The Adventure carried fewer hands than she once had. Teach told himself it was strategy. Smaller crews were easier to control, and smaller ships were faster. But beneath that logic ran a different current: exhaustion. Years of constant vigilance can wear down even the boldest of men. The constant readiness dulls the very edge it's meant to sharpen. For a time, the inlet offered simple comforts. The marsh smelled of life, not of salt and rot. The nights were quiet, filled only with the sound of insects and the distant surf. On deck, Teach could sit and feel, just for a moment, like a king at rest, rather than a fugitive on the run. He drank, he laughed, he told stories that grew taller with each telling. He reminded his men of their glorious victories, of merchant captains who had surrendered without a single shot, of naval squadrons that chased phantoms while he slipped away, laughing into the wind. Yet, a thread of unease ran through the calm. Teach wasn't ignorant of the world beyond the marsh. He knew that Charlestown still smarted from his blockade. He knew Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, was ambitious and impatient. And he knew, deep down, that the Royal Navy did not forgive humiliation. Intelligence reached him in fragments, whispers from fishermen, half-heard warnings from passing sloops, but nothing solid enough to force him to act. And so he waited, trusting that if danger came, it would announce itself loudly, with cannon fire and flags, just as it always had. This confidence was rooted in his experience. Teach had survived because he understood psychology just as well as he understood seamanship. He knew when to roar and when to bargain. He knew that showing mercy could, in its own way, be just as terrifying as showing cruelty. But the danger of living by your reputation is that you start to believe it actually protects you. His past successes had conditioned him to expect hesitation from his enemies. He assumed that any naval force sent after him would approach cautiously, announce itself with formality, maybe even try to negotiate. He never imagined small, nondescript sloops creeping low in the water, commanded by a man, Lieutenant Robert Maynard, who was willing to discard ceremony entirely for the element of surprise. On the morning before the battle, nothing seemed amiss. The weather was cooperative, the water smooth. Teach's men went about their small tasks, mending sails, cooking, cleaning pistols dulled by the sea salt. A lookout scanned the horizon, but without any real urgency. The inlet showed no sails, no drums, no flags. It looked like just another day, borrowed from fate. Teach moved among his crew with a relaxed authority. He joked with them, he cursed, he corrected small mistakes. He wore his famous beard braided and adorned with smoldering fuses, his pistols heavy on his chest. He was the embodiment of continuity, the living reassurance that nothing had changed. Inside, though, the calculations were running. If the Navy came, how quickly could he get underway? Which channel was deepest? Which of his men could be trusted to hold their nerve under pressure? When the first distant shapes finally appeared on the horizon, they didn't immediately trigger alarm. Small vessels were common here, traders, fishermen, local opportunists. The inlet saw traffic that survived by looking unthreatening. Teach watched them with mild interest, not suspicion. They were too few, too modest, too quiet to be the Crown's answer to his fearsome legend. That single assumption settled over the deck like a fog. Orders were not barked. Guns were not fully run out. The crew remained confident, almost casual, and Teach allowed it. He didn't want to sow fear without a clear cause. He didn't yet sense that fear was already on its way, riding low and patient on the tide, counting on this exact kind of confidence to open the door. As the tide began to shift, so did the balance of advantage. The inlet tightened. The choices narrowed. Teach still believed he held the center of the board, that he was in control. He couldn't yet see that the game had moved past reputation, past legend, into something much simpler and far more brutal. The calm persisted for a few moments more, stretched thin, just waiting for the moment when illusion would shatter, and these men would be forced to discover how much of their courage was their own and how much had only ever belonged to the stories. The morning broke thin and pale, the kind of light that made distances lie. The two approaching sloops slid forward without urgency, their sails loose, their hulls riding low. Two Blackbeard's eyes, they looked wrong but not wrong enough. They carried no markings of war, no aggressive formation. They just seemed tired, careless, as if blown off course. On one of those ships, Lieutenant Robert Maynard stood where he could be seen. This was deliberate. He wanted eyes on him, not on the dozens of men hidden below deck, crouching in silence, weapons ready. Above, only a handful moved about, performing weakness. The sloops looked undermanned because they were meant to. When the pirate lookout finally raised his voice, it was casual, not sharp. Strange vessels, yes, but no immediate threat. Blackbeard himself stepped forward, studying them. He hailed them with confidence, his voice carrying easily across the water. Who were they? What was their business here? The reply was measured, respectful. Traders, the voice said, low on provisions, seeking passage. It was the kind of answer that fit the place, the kind that rarely invited violence. Blackbeard, known as Edward Teach, waited for only a moment. He had learned that hesitation could be contagious. Better to assert control quickly. He ordered a warning shot. The cannon roared, shattering the quiet. The shot screamed through the air and tore into Maynard's lead sloop, splintering wood, cutting down men in a burst of blood and noise. The illusion of weakness suddenly looked dangerously real. For a breath, even Maynard wondered if his gamble had gone too far. But he did not turn away. The sloops pushed forward, now committed. Blackbeard followed with brutal efficiency, ordering a full broadside. Smoke swallowed the inlet, thick and choking, carrying the smell of sulfur and wet wood. Another volley tore into Maynard's vessel, killing and wounding, leaving the deck littered with bodies. To the pirates watching, it looked like victory unfolding exactly as expected. And that was the moment Maynard had been waiting for. As Blackbeard's sloop closed in, confident now, Maynard ordered his visible crew to scramble below. From the pirate deck, it looked like surrender, or maybe annihilation. Teach laughed. He called for grappling hooks and ordered his crew to board and finish it. The two vessels slammed together with a sound like breaking bone. Grapnels bit deep. Pirates surged forward, weapons drawn, expecting little resistance. They poured onto Maynard's deck, shouting in triumph, their boots slipping on blood and shattered planks. Then, the deck came alive. From below, Maynard's men erupted upward, firing pistols at point-blank range, their blades flashing in the smoke. The trap snapped shut. The surprise reversed itself with violent speed. The pirates staggered, suddenly outnumbered, suddenly unsure. Shouts of victory turned to screams of terror. Blackbeard was among the first to cross. He moved into the fight with raw ferocity, cutting through the confusion, his pistols roaring, his cutlass swinging. He was exactly what the stories promised, huge, loud, and relentless. He fought not like a man trying to conserve himself, but like one who believed survival was a function of will alone. Maynard spotted him almost immediately. Around them, the battle fragmented into dozens of private warsmen grappling, falling, stabbing, and dying without witnesses. They met near the center of the deck. Teach fired first. The pistol ball tore into Maynard's body. Pain flared, but adrenaline carried him forward. He returned fire, his shot hitting Blackbeard, but it didn't stop him. They closed, blades ringing as steel met steel. Maynard was precise, disciplined, driven by duty and the knowledge that retreat was impossible. They traded blows at arm's length. Teach taunted him, cursing, even laughing as blood ran down his body. He had been wounded before. To him, wounds were proof of survival. Each one was small, none immediately fatal, but together, they were eroding the myth of his invincibility. Around them, the tide of the battle turned decisively. Maynard's men, now fully engaged, pushed the pirates back. The element of surprise held. Teach's crew, already thin, began to falter. Their confidence drained away, replaced by the dawning realization that a fearsome reputation could not reload pistols or close wounds. Teach pressed on regardless. He struck Maynard again, driving him back. Then one of Maynard's men stepped in, his blade flashing. Another followed. Blackbeard staggered under the sudden, combined pressure. He fought them all, refusing to fall, refusing to retreat. But the end came not with a single dramatic blow, but with grim inevitability. Teach absorbed shot after shot, cut after cut. The body that had carried the legend finally reached its limit. He went down hard, collapsing onto the deck he had meant to dominate. The fight drained out of the inlet almost immediately. Some leaped into the water, trying to swim for the marsh and freedom. Most were cut down or captured. Maynard stood over Blackbeard's body, breathing hard, his clothes soaked in blood. The man on the deck looked smaller than the stories. His famous beard matted, his eyes finally still. A myth has weight only while it's moving. Once the motion stops, it just becomes flesh and bone again. There was no celebration. The work was not finished. Maynard knew his orders, and he followed them with grim efficiency. Blackbeard's head was severed and hung from the bowsprit, a brutal banner meant to speak louder than any proclamation. Proof mattered. Fear was being reclaimed. As the sun climbed higher, the inlet bore witness to the aftermath. Debris drifted on the water. The entire battle had lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would echo for generations. What had begun as a careful deception had ended in raw violence, the kind that strips away performance and leaves only results. The Royal Navy had not outgunned the Pirate King. It had outweighted him, outfought him, and forced him into a fight where legend could not compensate for numbers and preparation. By midday, the sloops were ready to depart, one carrying a grisly trophy, the other carrying the weight of what had been done. The inlet closed behind them, swallowing sound and smoke, returning to its deceptive calm. But the stories were already forming, reshaping themselves around a new truth. This was the day fear itself had been boarded, surrounded, and cut down in shallow water. The inlet emptied slowly, as if reluctant to let go of what it had just seen. The water carried away scraps of sailcloth and darkened planks, erasing the chaos of battle with practiced indifference. But what remained aboard Lieutenant Robert Maynard's sloop was far harder to wash away. Blackbeard's body lay where it had fallen, heavy now, and unmistakably mortal. The famous beard that once framed fire and fury was tangled with blood. The face beneath it, the face of Edward Teach, was strangely unremarkable in death. Lieutenant Maynard didn't linger over the corpse. He understood how fragile victory was in these colonial waters. Rumors could easily undo facts if those facts weren't made visible. His orders had been explicit, and he carried them out without a hint of embellishment. The severed head of the world's most feared pirate was raised and fixed to the bowsprit of his ship, swaying gently as the sloop turned north. This wasn't an act of vengeance. It was verification. The effect was immediate and deliberate. Sailors who saw it fell silent. Pirates who heard of it scattered. Merchants who had long doubted the Crown's resolve began to recalculate their risks. The Atlantic world ran on stories, and this one was designed to be unmistakable. Blackbeard wasn't just defeated, he was displayed, reduced from a terrifying legend to simple, undeniable proof. As Maynard's sloops made their way back through familiar waters, the shock began to ripple outward. In Virginia, Governor Spotswood received the news with a satisfaction sharpened by politics. He had acted beyond his legal jurisdiction, launching the attack into North Carolina's territory. But success insulated him from the consequences. Authority, once demonstrated, has a powerful way of justifying itself. In North Carolina, the reaction was more complicated. Officials who had quietly tolerated, and even profited from, Teach's presence, suddenly discovered strong opinions against piracy. Convenience is a powerful motivator, and allegiances shifted overnight. Maynard's return wasn't the triumphant celebration that ballads would later suggest. The decks of his ships were scarred and bloodstained. Men were wounded, some so badly they would never sail again. The price of this decisive action had been paid in blood by sailors whose names would never travel far beyond their home ports. Still, naval discipline held. The Royal Navy had proven that it could adapt, shedding formal ceremony when necessary, and meeting irregular threats with irregular solutions. The head remained mounted on the bowsprit as the sloop entered the harbor, a grim punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had run on for far too long. Crowds gathered on the docks, some cheering, others staring in disbelief. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders for a better look. Fear and relief mixed uneasily in the air. For years, Blackbeard had existed as a kind of roaming storm, unpredictable, theatrical, and seemingly immune to any consequence. Seeing the end of him, this grotesque proof of his mortality, forced people to confront just how much power they had surrendered to the idea of him. His body, meanwhile, was discarded at sea, unceremoniously returned to the element that had both sustained and betrayed him. Of course, sailors later swore that it swam around the ship multiple times before finally sinking. A final act of defiance from a legend unwilling to fade quietly. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The story spread, already reshaping itself into myth. Death didn't end Blackbeard's influence, it simply transformed it. In taverns and on docks, from the Carolinas all the way to New England, the tale was told and retold, each time becoming sharper. Some storytellers emphasized his ferocity, fighting to his very last breath. Others lingered on the cunning strategy that had finally undone him. And with each retelling, the Royal Navy's role grew cleaner, more heroic. The messy truth that victory had hinged on deception, luck, and timing, just as much as on bravery, was smoothed over into something easier to digest. Piracy did not end with Blackbeard. Ships were still taken, crews still mutinied, the Atlantic remained a vast and lawless place, and the arm of authority was still very short at its edges. But something fundamental had shifted. The era of the untouchable pirate king, the celebrity outlaw, was dimming. Fear alone was no longer enough to build an empire. Survival now required mobility, secrecy, and smaller ambitions. The great theatrical figures like Blackbeard had become liabilities rather than assets. For the Crown, the lesson cut both ways. Sometimes, it was about understanding the enemy's psychology and turning it against them. The Royal Navy would carry that lesson forward, refining tactics for irregular warfare that would echo in conflicts far removed from the barrier islands and marshgrass of North Carolina. Lieutenant Maynard himself did not become a towering figure of legend. He returned to service, was promoted for his success, but was never immortalized in the same way as the man he killed. History remembers him largely because of Blackbeard, and perhaps that imbalance feels appropriate. The age was shaped more by its myths than by the men who dismantled them. Blackbeard's name, meanwhile, detached itself from the body that had once carried it. It became shorthand for defiance, for excess, for a certain kind of freedom twisted into menace. Plays, pamphlets, and later, novels and movies, would exaggerate his cruelty and his grandeur, polishing him into a figure far larger than life. Few would dwell on the quiet miscalculations he made at Ocracoke, the reduced crew he had with him. The overconfidence, the fatal assumption that his terrifying reputation could substitute for vigilance. The inlet itself returned to obscurity. The tides shifted the sandbars. Fishermen resumed their familiar routes. Only occasionally would someone point out at the water and recount how, for less than an hour, it had been the center of the Atlantic world. The landscape did not memorialize the battle. It simply absorbed it. What truly endured was the recalibration of power. The colonies learned that piracy could be crushed when it became too inconvenient. The pirates learned that pardons were traps just as often as they were protections. And the sailors on every ship learned that legends are dangerous, precisely because they encourage you to believe in a story instead of preparing for reality. The Battle of Ocracoke Inlet didn't end an era cleanly. It closed a chapter with a brutal, inelegant slash. The story didn't fade. It condensed, becoming sharper and more potent with time. Fear lost its crown that day, but it did not disappear. It simply changed its shape. Waiting for the next figure willing to wear it, and for the next hunter patient enough to let it come close. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into history, be sure to like and subscribe for more stories.